Sometimes the people who can't stop thinking about you are the very people who seem the least affected by your absence. They don't call, they don't text, they don't reach out. And yet somehow, years later, your name still triggers something inside them. Most people assume that if someone truly cared, they would show it. But human nature rarely works that way. In fact, some of the strongest emotional attachments are hidden behind distance, silence, and apparent indifference. And the strange part is that the people who leave the deepest mark on us are often not the people we spent the most time with. They're the people who awaken something unfinished, something unresolved, something that never found closure. And if you've ever wondered why certain people seem unable to fully let go of you, even after months or years, there's a reason almost nobody talks about. Because it has very little to do with what you gave them, and everything to do with what happened inside them when they were around you. Most people think memory works like a photograph. You experience something, you store it, you remember it. But emotional memory doesn't work that way. Emotional memory is selective. It keeps what disturbed us, what surprised us, what challenged us, what changed us. Think about the people you've forgotten. Many of them were kind. Many treated you well. Many were perfectly pleasant. Yet they vanished from your mind without effort. Now think about the people you still remember. The ones who occasionally enter your thoughts for no apparent reason. The ones whose names still create a reaction. Notice something. It isn't always love. It isn't always attraction. Sometimes it's confusion. Sometimes regret. Sometimes admiration. Sometimes curiosity. The emotion changes, but the psychological imprint remains. And that's where things become interesting, because people rarely obsess over what they fully understand. They obsess over what remains unfinished. A friendship that ended abruptly. A relationship that never became what it could have been. A conversation left unsaid. A goodbye that never happened. The mind hates open loops. It constantly searches for completion, and when it cannot find it, it keeps returning. Again, and again, and again. But that's only the surface layer. Most people stop there. They assume unfinished business is the entire explanation. It isn't. Something deeper is happening. Imagine two people meet. Maybe it's dating. Maybe it's friendship. Maybe it's someone they work with every day. At first, everything feels ordinary. Then something shifts. One person begins to see themselves differently around the other. More confident, more alive, more understood, more challenged, more authentic. Without realizing it, they start associating those feelings with that person. Not because the other person created those qualities, but because they revealed them. And that distinction changes everything. Because years later, when they think about you, they may not actually be thinking about you. They may be thinking about who they became around you. Most people never realize this. They assume they miss the person. Often they miss the version of themselves that appeared in that person's presence. The version that felt fearless. The version that felt desired. The version that felt seen. And once someone experiences that, forgetting becomes much harder than people imagine. What if they never missed you the way they thought they did? What if they missed themselves? That possibility explains countless mysteries. The ex who keeps checking your social media, the old friend who occasionally reappears, the coworker who remembers details about you years later, the person who vanished but never truly moved on. They're not always searching for you. Sometimes they're searching for the part of themselves they lost when you disappeared. And yet, even that isn't the deepest layer. Because human beings don't simply remember experiences. They project meaning onto them. This is where things become uncomfortable. When someone cannot stop thinking about you, they often aren't remembering reality. They're remembering a psychological symbol, a story, an idea, a possibility. The mind fills gaps with imagination, and imagination is almost always more powerful than reality. That's why short relationships sometimes leave deeper scars than long ones. The relationship itself wasn't necessarily extraordinary. The possibilities were. The future they imagined. The life they projected. The conversations that never happened. The moments that never arrived. The person becomes larger than life because reality never had the chance to limit the fantasy. And that's where countless people get trapped. Not in memory, in imagination. But here's the contradiction. The less someone fully possessed you, the more space their imagination had to grow. Most people think attachment comes from having. Very often, it comes from not having. The relationship that felt incomplete, the attraction that remained uncertain, the connection that never fully settled, the mystery that never disappeared. And this explains something many people experience but rarely understand. Sometimes the person who can't stop thinking about you isn't the person who loved you most. It's the person who never figured you out. Because certainty creates closure. Mystery creates return visits. The mind keeps reopening what it cannot solve. And nowhere is this more obvious than in modern relationships. Someone gets ghosted. They don't spend months thinking about the good moments. They spend months trying to understand what happened. Someone becomes emotionally distant. The other person doesn't obsess over certainty. They obsess over ambiguity. The unanswered question becomes more powerful than the answer itself. And that's where everything starts to deepen. Because beneath every obsession lies something people don't want to admit. It isn't always about affection. Sometimes it's about ego. The ego desperately wants coherence. It wants explanations. It wants to believe it understands people. So when someone leaves unexpectedly, changes suddenly, moves on faster than expected, or refuses to provide closure, the ego experiences a wound. Not because of the person, because of uncertainty. And uncertainty can last far longer than heartbreak. But there is an even deeper force operating underneath all of this. A force that explains why certain people become unforgettable, even when they weren't perfect, even when they weren't available, even when they weren't supposed to matter. Carl Jung called it projection. And most people spend their entire lives unaware of how much power it has over them. Sometimes we meet someone and become fascinated almost instantly, not because we truly know them, because we unconsciously attach hidden parts of ourselves to them, our desires, our fears, our potential, our shadow, our unlived life. Without realizing it, we turn them into a mirror, and the moment that happens, forgetting them becomes nearly impossible, because losing them feels like losing a part of ourselves. But here's the secret almost nobody sees. The people who can't stop thinking about you are often not attached to who you are. They're attached to what you awakened. And once you understand what was awakened, everything about attraction, memory, longing, and emotional attachment begins to look completely different. Because the real reason they can't stop thinking about you has been hiding beneath the surface this entire time. And the moment you see it, you'll understand why some people remain unforgettable long after they are gone. Not because they were loved, not because they were desired, but because they activated something buried deep inside the unconscious mind that most people spend their entire lives trying to find again. And that hidden force is where the real story begins. Because what was awakened was never just an emotion, it was an identity. And identities are far harder to forget than people. Most relationships begin on the surface. Two people talk, they laugh, they spend time together, they share experiences. But occasionally, something unusual happens. Someone enters your life and touches a part of you that had been sleeping for years. Maybe they made you feel understood in a way nobody else had. Maybe they challenged a version of yourself you had outgrown. Maybe they saw potential in you before you saw it in yourself. Whatever it was, their presence became connected to a psychological awakening. And that's where attachment becomes dangerous. Because now the person is no longer just a person. They become a doorway, a symbol, a trigger connected to something larger than themselves. Most people don't realize this while it's happening. They think they're falling for the individual. What they're actually falling for is the experience unfolding inside them. And when that experience disappears, confusion begins. The strange part is that the mind often protects itself by focusing on the wrong thing. Instead of asking, what did this person awaken in me? It asks, how do I get this person back? That mistake keeps people trapped for years, because the person was never the source. They were the catalyst, and catalysts leave powerful memories behind. Think about the people who constantly return to old messages, old photos, old conversations, old social media profiles. What are they searching for? Most believe they're searching for the relationship. But if that were true, the memories would satisfy them. Instead, the memories create even more longing, because what they're truly searching for cannot be found in photographs. They're searching for a feeling, a version of themselves, a state of being. And that's why no amount of replaying the past ever works. The thing they lost was internal, not external. But here's where human behavior becomes even more fascinating. What if their silence was never proof they stopped caring? What if silence was evidence that they cared more than they wanted to admit? Most people misunderstand silence. They assume silence means absence of emotion. Often it means the opposite. Some of the strongest emotions produce the least communication. Not because the feelings aren't there, because the feelings are difficult to face. Pride gets involved. Fear gets involved. Ego gets involved. Sometimes people stay silent because reaching out would force them to confront something unresolved. Sometimes they stay silent because they know the conversation won't change anything, and sometimes they stay silent because they're trying to convince themselves they've moved on. Yet their thoughts continue returning, again and again. The conscious mind says, it's over. The unconscious whispers, not yet. And that conflict can continue for years, especially when the connection touched something deeper than attraction. Because attraction fades, novelty fades, excitement fades. Identity does not. The people who remain unforgettable usually become connected to a turning point in someone's life, a period of growth, a moment of transformation, a chapter of self-discovery. Years later, the memory of that person becomes linked to the memory of becoming someone new, and that's incredibly difficult to erase. This is why people often remember relationships differently as time passes. At first, they remember the events. Later, they remember the meaning. The details fade. The emotional significance remains. A conversation disappears. A feeling survives. A face becomes blurry. An impact remains crystal clear. But most people completely miss the darkest part of this process. Because not every unforgettable person leaves behind admiration. Some leave behind regret. And regret possesses a unique kind of power. Unlike sadness, regret continuously creates alternative realities. The mind begins imagining different outcomes, different choices, different endings. If only I had said this. If only I had stayed. If only I had left sooner. If only I had understood. Regret keeps the past alive because it never accepts finality. It continuously rewrites history in search of a better ending. And that's why people who seemed unaffected sometimes think about someone for decades, Not because they're still in love, because they're still negotiating with a past that cannot be changed. But there is another layer beneath regret, one that Jung understood exceptionally well. The shadow. The shadow contains everything we reject about ourselves, traits we hide, desires we suppress, emotions we avoid, needs we deny. And sometimes another person accidentally exposes those hidden parts. That exposure can be unforgettable. Perhaps they revealed your vulnerability. Perhaps they exposed your insecurity. Perhaps they awakened your ambition. Perhaps they forced you to confront loneliness. Whatever emerged, it wasn't comfortable, yet it was real. And reality leaves fingerprints. The people who affect us most are often the people who reveal truths we were trying to avoid, not because they intended to, because their presence made hiding impossible. That's why some individuals trigger unusually strong reactions: admiration, jealousy, attraction, resentment, obsession. These emotions often point towards something deeper than the relationship itself. They point toward an encounter with the unconscious, and once that encounter happens, forgetting becomes difficult because the experience feels significant, even if you can't explain why, even if you barely knew them, even if nothing ever happened between you. The emotional intensity wasn't created by the amount of time spent together. It was created by the depth of what was activated. And this leads to one of the most uncomfortable truths about human nature. The people who leave the deepest imprint are rarely the people who fit perfectly into our lives. They're often the people who interrupted our psychological routine, the ones who disrupted certainty, the ones who challenged assumptions, the ones who made us question who we were. Growth rarely comes from comfort. Transformation rarely comes from predictability. The mind remembers disruption, especially when that disruption changed its direction. And now we arrive at the hidden truth that explains everything. The reason they can't stop thinking about you is not because you occupied their mind, it's because you altered their inner world. You changed the way they saw themselves, the way they saw relationships, the way they saw possibility, the way they saw reality. After certain encounters, people cannot return to who they were before, even if they desperately want to, even if they never speak to that person again, even if decades pass. Something fundamental has shifted, and that's what becomes unforgettable. Not the person, the transformation. The relationship becomes the marker. The awakening becomes the memory. The individual becomes associated with a moment the psyche refuses to lose, because that moment represents meaning. And human beings will forget almost anything except meaning. Names fade, dates fade, conversations fade. Meaning survives. This is why some people disappear from your life, yet remain present in your mind, not as people, as symbols. Symbols of growth, symbols of loss, symbols of possibility, symbols of who you were, or who you could have become. And perhaps the most ironic part of all is this: the people who spend years wondering whether they mattered often mattered far more than they realize. Because influence is rarely measured by proximity, it is measured by impact. Some people stay close and change nothing. Others leave and change everything. And once you understand that, the strange realization begins to emerge. Being unforgettable has very little to do with beauty, very little to do with status, very little to do with perfection. The unforgettable people are often the ones who awaken dormant parts of the human soul, the ones who force others to see something they couldn't see before, the ones who become mirrors rather than attractions. And mirrors are powerful, because long after the reflection disappears, people continue searching for what they saw inside it. Maybe that's why certain names never fully disappear. Maybe that's why certain memories return without invitation. Maybe that's why some people continue appearing in dreams years later. The mind isn't always revisiting the person. Sometimes it's revisiting a transformation that was never fully understood. And when you finally recognize that truth, everything changes. You stop asking why someone can't stop thinking about you. You start asking what awakened when your paths crossed. Because that answer reveals something far deeper than attraction. It reveals the hidden forces shaping memory, attachment, longing, and human connection itself. And once you see that, you'll never look at relationships the same way again. You'll realize that the most powerful connections are not always the longest, not always the closest, not even always the happiest. They're the ones that change who we are. And the human mind has a remarkable tendency to remember anything that changed its soul.